It was upon a raw October evening in the year 1889 that I first encountered the strange affair which was destined to stir both public alarm and private terror, though at the time it came to us with little more than a whisper of menace. I had returned from my medical rounds to find Sherlock Holmes deep in his armchair, the blue wreaths of cigarette smoke curling languidly above his hawk-like profile. His violin lay neglected upon the Persian rug, which told me that even music had failed to occupy his restless mind. The hour was just striking 8 when a loud and hurried knock rattled the door of Baker Street. Before Mrs. Hudson could answer, the door burst open, and a man of some 30 years, pale-faced and drenched from the evening mist, stumbled into our sitting-room. His clothes bore the respectable cut of a gentleman, though dishevelled from travel, and his eyes darted about with a look of hunted desperation. "I beg you, Mr. Holmes," he cried breathlessly. "You must help me, sir. I have received the warning, the dreadful warning. I am a marked man." Holmes rose slowly, his keen grey eyes fixed upon the stranger. "Pray compose yourself," he said with quiet authority. "Take this chair by the fire. Watson, perhaps a glass of brandy." As I obeyed, I observed the trembling of the man's hands. He pulled from his breast pocket a crumpled envelope, and from it shook upon the table 5 shriveled orange pips. They rolled across the polished surface and came to rest like some malignant omen. Holmes's brows drew together, and for a moment his expression darkened with recognition. "Ah," he murmured softly, almost to himself. "Again?" Our visitor started. "Then you know of it?" "You know what it means?" Holmes gave a slight inclination of the head, but offered no immediate reply. He lit a fresh cigarette, the flame of the match throwing sharp shadows across his angular features. "Before I speak, sir," Holmes said at length, "we must have your name and your narrative. Without facts, there can be no inquiry." The man swallowed hard. "My name is Elias Thorne of Sussex. 3 days passed, and I received a letter bearing no return address. Within it were these 5 pips and a scrawled message. 'Put your house in order. You have 7 days.' His voice quavered as he continued, "My father, he died after receiving just such a message. They said it was an accident, but I know better. And now it has come for me." At this, Holmes leaned forward, his thin fingers steepled. His eyes gleamed with that peculiar light I had come to associate with the scent of a mystery worthy of his powers. "You have done wisely to come to me, Mr. Thorne," Holmes said, "for though the world may call these pips a trifle, I perceive in them a most deadly earnest." Holmes regarded the man intently for several moments before speaking, his gaze never leaving the trembling figure in the chair. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire and the irregular patter of rain against the window panes. At last he rose, paced once across the room with hands clasped behind his back, and then turned suddenly to our visitor. "You speak of your father's death in connection with such a message. That fact alone renders this matter one of the gravest imports. But first, Watson, you observe the mud upon Mr. Thorne's boots? Not the common London clay, but a reddish soil speckled with chalk. It is plain he has come up from the southern counties, and not long since, for the damp still clings to it. Notice also the smudge upon his cuff, a recent brush against oiled metal. A railway carriage, I dare say, with its infernal soot. Mr. Thorne has travelled directly from Sussex within the last hour or two, and in some agitation since his collar is ill-fastened and his waistcoat unbuttoned." The young man's eyes widened. "That is precisely so. I came up from Chichester by the 7 o'clock train, and in such haste that I scarcely thought of my dress." Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. "The smallest details, Mr. Thorne, betray much to those who care to look. Now let us hear everything from the beginning. Your father's fate, your own experience, and any circumstance which may bear upon this mystery." The gentleman drew a deep, steadying breath and began. "My father, Sir Reginald Thorne, was a retired officer of the East India Company. He settled upon our estate near Arundel after many years abroad. 3 years ago, in the spring of '86, he received a letter such as I have shown you, an envelope with 5 dried orange pips and a message warning him to prepare. My father laughed it off at first, though he grew restless in the days that followed. On the 7th day, while out riding, his horse bolted at a sudden noise. He was thrown and struck his head upon a stone. The coroner returned a verdict of accidental death. Yet my father was an excellent horseman, and I have always suspected there was more to it." Holmes nodded gravely. "And you yourself received such a letter but 3 days past?" "Yes, with the same dreadful tokens. I scarcely knew what to do, but I recalled the tragedy and resolved at once to seek counsel in London. My mother urged me to stay at home, but the thought of waiting there, helpless, was intolerable." "Very wise," Holmes said softly. "And tell me, what was your father's life abroad? Did he make enemies, debts, questionable associations?" Thorne hesitated. "He was a just man, but stern. He spoke little of his years in India, save for the climate and the officers he knew. Yet I recall once, when I was a boy, hearing a quarrel between my father and a visitor, a dark-skinned man, a native who came late one evening. They argued in hushed tones, and my father dismissed him angrily. I never saw the man again." Holmes's long fingers tapped the arm of his chair. "Interesting, very interesting. And these pips, did your father preserve them?" "No, he cast them into the fire at once. I had nearly done the same, but something in me made me keep them and bring them to you." "You did well. Watson, you perceive how history repeats itself, the identical warning, the identical span of days. I should not be surprised if, by the week's end, some contrivance were arranged to silence our client. We must act with dispatch. I confess, I shuddered, for Holmes spoke not with melodrama, but with cold certainty." He turned again to Thorne. "You must answer a few more questions with precision. In whose hand was the note written?" "It was scrawled crudely in block letters, as though to disguise the hand." "The envelope bore a London postmark." "London, eh? That simplifies matters. And the message? Only the words, 'Put your house in order. You have 7 days.'" "Just so." Holmes reached for his magnifying lens and examined the envelope closely. He noted the faint watermark upon the paper, the quality of the ink, and even the fibres clinging to the flap. Then, replacing it upon the table, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed in thought. "There is more here than a mere threat," he said at last. "The pips are no random symbol. They have been chosen for their association, perhaps with some society, perhaps with an oath. Such devices are the currency of secret brotherhoods, Watson. Recall the red circle, the scarlet band. This, I believe, is of the same order." Our visitor shivered visibly. "Then you think I am indeed in mortal peril?" "I do," Holmes replied bluntly. "And if we do not unravel the riddle before the appointed day, you may suffer the same fate as your father. But despair not, there is always a thread to be followed, however fine." Holmes rose once more and paced the room. "You will remain in London, Mr. Thorne. Secure lodgings where you may not be easily observed. Watson and I shall undertake the inquiries. I must see the letter-box at your Sussex estate and examine the place of your father's death. Until then, do not walk alone at night, and speak of this to no one save your mother. Can I rely upon your discretion?" "You may, Mr. Holmes. You may indeed." The young man clasped Holmes's hand fervently, then mine, and with some colour restored to his cheeks, he took his leave. When the door had closed, I turned to my companion. "You spoke with such certainty of his danger. Do you truly believe the menace to be so immediate?" Holmes regarded me gravely. "Watson, when death knocks once at a household's door, it may be an accident. Twice it is a coincidence, but thrice? That is murder concealed beneath ritual. These pips are not mere fruit, but the calling card of vengeance. I would stake my reputation upon it." He stood silently by the window for a moment, gazing into the fog that curled along Baker Street. Then, with a sudden decision, he took his hat and cloak. "Come, Watson. The
night is yet young, and London has 1,000 tongues. We must learn who sends orange pips through the post, and why. Our client's life depends upon it." And so, scarcely an hour after Elias Thorne had departed, we ourselves stepped into the misty street, little knowing that the trail we were about to follow would draw us into one of the darkest and most chilling enigmas that had ever crossed the threshold of Baker Street. The night air was chill and heavy with fog as Holmes and I made our way along Baker Street, the lamps throwing halos of dim yellow light into the murk. He strode quickly, his tall figure moving with restless energy, while I kept pace at his side, my mind still full of the ominous pips that had rattled across our table. Holmes spoke little, but from time to time he muttered some observation half under his breath, as though piecing together fragments of a puzzle invisible to all but himself. Our first destination was the General Post Office near St. Martin's-le-Grand. Holmes had judged that if the threatening letter bore a London mark, it must have passed through their hands. We entered by a side door still open to late correspondence, and Holmes at once requested an interview with the night supervisor. His reputation was such that no door closed long against him, and within a quarter of an hour we were in the office where great sacks of mail were being sorted by weary clerks under gaslight. Holmes presented the envelope to the official, pointing with his long finger at the blurred impression of the cancellation mark. "Observe, Watson. The letters here are indistinct, yet we can make out a portion of the stamp. Temple Bar." Thus the missive was posted near Fleet Street. The supervisor confirmed Holmes's deduction. "Yes, sir, that hand stamp is used at the Temple Bar sub-office." "I fear I cannot tell you more without the exact time of posting." "Even that is useful," Holmes remarked. "We narrow our circle. A posting place near Fleet Street within the last week. That quarter of London swarms with lawyers, printers, and disreputable agents of every shade. We must tread carefully." Outside once more, Holmes drew in the foggy air with a sharp breath, as though it spurred his faculties. "Watson, you will recall that Elias Thorne spoke of his father's years in India and of a quarrel with a native visitor. I suspect that the root and branch of this affair lie not in Sussex, but in some forgotten incident of the elder Thorne's past. These pips are the tokens of a vengeance that spans oceans and years, yet why deliver them now?" I asked. "Why after 3 years of silence should the son be threatened in the same manner?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we must learn. The hands that sent the first letter are the same that postmarked the second, or at least belong to the same fraternity. The vendetta did not die with Sir Reginald Thorne. It merely slumbered
until some event reawakened it." We took a cab toward Fleet Street, and Holmes instructed the driver to set us down near the Temple Bar sub-office itself. He wished, he said, to gain a sense of the locality, to look upon the faces of those who haunted its public houses and alleys. We strolled slowly through the fog-laden thoroughfare, Holmes's sharp eyes darting from figure to figure. At one corner he paused before a tavern, its windows glowing, and its door alive with laughter and quarrel. He lingered but did not enter. "No," he murmured, "too public. Our adversary will not show his hand so openly. Yet there is something of the river about this smell, Watson. Do you notice it? Tar, rope, and wet timber. I should not be surprised if our quarry were more at home along the wharves than in Fleet Street chambers. A posting office is but a convenience. I could only nod, for Holmes's reasoning, though swift, always seemed to leap 2 steps beyond my comprehension. We returned at last to Baker Street, and it was well past midnight when we ascended the familiar stairs. Holmes threw himself into his chair, eyes alight with that inward fire I knew so well. "We have 2 lines to pursue," he said briskly. "First, the connection between Sir Reginald's past and these pips. Second, the physical trail of the letter itself. Tomorrow, Watson, we journey to Sussex. There I shall examine the scene of the elder Thorne's death and the letterbox from which his warning came. If my suspicions are correct, we shall find some thread that binds both generations of the family to this shadow that now hunts them." I slept poorly that night, troubled by visions of orange pips scattering across the floor like drops of blood, but Holmes was up with the dawn, refreshed and eager. After a hasty breakfast, we caught the morning train south. Holmes spent the journey buried in a small monograph of his own, making upon secret societies, occasionally making penciled notes in the margin, while I looked out upon the misty fields of Surrey and considered the danger into which our client had been cast. At Chichester Station, Elias Thorne awaited us. He looked wan and haggard, as though sleep had eluded him, but he brightened visibly at the sight of Holmes. A trap conveyed us to the family estate, a fine old house of mellow brick set amid autumn woods. Lady Thorne received us with trembling courtesy. She was a gentlewoman whose grief at her husband's death still lay heavy upon her, and her eyes filled with tears as Holmes spoke words of assurance that we should do all in our power for her son's safety. We were soon conducted to the stable-yard where Sir Reginald had met his end. Holmes surveyed the ground minutely, measuring distances with his eye, noting the slope of the path, the line of trees, the position of a broken wall. He knelt where the horse had fallen and sifted the gravel between his fingers. "Watson, you will observe how little chance there was for a horse to stumble of its own accord. The path is level, the footing sure, yet the animal bolted. What force startled it? Perhaps a gunshot," I suggested. "Precisely. Or the crack of a whip, the sudden flash of something unnatural. But there is more. See this stone? It bears a faint indentation as though struck by metal. The horse may have shot against it in its frenzy. It suggests sudden panic, not gradual loss of control." We next inspected the letterbox by the gate, from which Sir Reginald had received his fateful envelope. Holmes examined the wood with his glass, searching for any trace of tampering. He found little, save that the box bore faint scratches near the lock, as though a rough key had been forced within at some point. "Interesting," he murmured. "Someone wished to be certain their message reached the intended hand. But who posted it, and from where?" Thorne led us then to his father's study, a dark-panelled room lined with shelves of books, many concerning India. Here Holmes spent an hour in silence, riffling through journals, ledgers, and packets of letters. At last he drew forth a sheaf of papers tied with faded ribbon. "Ah, here we touch the heart of the matter." He spread them upon the desk, revealing correspondence in a bold hand, much of it signed with initials only. The letters spoke of investments, of shipments from Calcutta, and of quarrels over accounts. One, dated some 20 years past, contained a veiled threat should certain sums not be paid. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Watson, mark this well. A dispute left unresolved, an oath taken in anger. The seed was sown long ago, and now, like these pips, the fruit has ripened into vengeance. We have our link." Elias Thorne bent over the paper, pale with alarm. "Do you mean my father's death was no accident, that he was hunted even then?" "I fear so," Holmes said gravely. "And that the same hand, or its successor, now points at you." The room seemed to darken as he spoke, though the morning sun shone through the window. It was as though some unseen presence stood among us, grim and implacable, waiting for the appointed day. Holmes remained bent over the packet of papers, his keen eyes darting across the faded ink, as though the very letters themselves whispered secrets to him. He read in silence for some minutes, then selected one sheet and held it up against the light. The writing, though old, was still clear, the strokes vigorous and unhesitating. "Observe, Watson," he said, tapping the page. "Here is mention of a society, though not by name, whose emblem was a seed to remind its members of oaths sown deep and obligations never to be forgotten. The correspondent warns Sir Reginald that unless he honours certain terms, the seeds will be scattered upon his house. What more obvious than these orange pips, delivered across the gulf of years? A threat, clothed in ritual form. Elias Thorne leaned forward, his voice low and strained. "But surely, Mr. Holmes, this must be some petty matter of trade. My father was a man of honour. He would never have been party to crime or villainy." Holmes looked up sharply, his expression unreadable. "Petty?" "No, my good sir, nothing petty here. The very fact that this warning has been renewed after so long proves the opposite. An association that can preserve its vengeance over decades is not to be treated lightly." He replaced the papers with care and turned suddenly to Lady Thorne, who sat quietly by the hearth, her hands clasped in agitation. "Madam, do you recall your husband ever speaking of a body of men, perhaps in India, bound together by oath? Did he ever allude to quarrels with such a company?" The poor lady shook her head. "He spoke little of India, Mr. Holmes. When I pressed him, he would grow silent or change the subject. Once, I remember, he said, 'Those years are behind me. I want them to stay behind me.'" Holmes's lips tightened. Then we must dig where he feared to tread. "Watson, you see the pattern. An old quarrel abroad, the symbol of the seed, a vow carried across the seas. I think we approach the heart of the matter." Elias Thorne paced the room, his agitation increasing. "If what you say is true, then I am condemned. How can I stand against enemies unseen, whose motives I cannot fathom? If they slew my father, what chance would I have?" Holmes rose and laid a hand upon his shoulder with unexpected gentleness. "Courage, Mr. Thorne. The man who foresees danger has already robbed it of half its power. Your father was unprepared, you are not. That alone shifts the odds in your favour. Besides, we may yet bring these shadows into the light." His reassurance steadied the young man somewhat, and Holmes then requested to be shown the remainder of the estate, particularly the grounds and outbuildings. We spent the better part of the afternoon in careful examination. Holmes inspected the stable doors, the iron gates, even the bark of the trees near where Sir Reginald had fallen. He noted every trace of wear, every odd mark invisible to the untrained eye. More than once he called me to observe some minute detail, a broken twig, a faint scrape of metal, that to me seemed trivial but to him bore significance. As the sun declined, we returned to the study. Holmes seated himself at the desk, where he remained absorbed in his own reflections. Elias Thorne watched him anxiously, while Lady Thorne busied herself with the tea service, her hands trembling so that the china rattled. At length Holmes spoke. Mr. Thorne, I must ask you a most particular question. Have you in your possession any of your father's old correspondence with India beyond what we have seen? Perhaps something kept hidden, or too sensitive to destroy? Elias flushed slightly. There is one box, sir. My father charged me never to open it save in dire necessity. It is locked, and I have respected his wish. Where is it now? Holmes asked, his eyes glittering. In the attic. I will fetch it at once. He returned presently with a small iron box, tarnished with age. It bore a stout lock which Holmes regarded with satisfaction. Excellent. Watson, oblige me with your penknife. There are few locks so strong that a little pressure cannot overcome them. With deft manipulation, he had it open in a trice. Inside lay a bundle of letters, a ledger bound in calfskin, and a curious object wrapped in cloth. Holmes unrolled the cloth to reveal a small wooden token carved in the shape of a seed, darkened with age. He held it up between finger and thumb, his face gravely. Here is the emblem itself, he said softly. This trinket binds the chain together. Whoever sent those pips meant you to recall this symbol and tremble at its meaning. He turned to the letters and swiftly scanned their contents. They spoke of an enterprise in India, a group of men who had sworn brotherhood, perhaps in commerce, perhaps in blood. There were references to secret punishments, to obligations enforced by fear. One letter, unsigned, contained only a single phrase repeated 3 times. The seeds will fall. Holmes replaced the documents, closed the box, and leaned back in his chair, lost in thought. For several minutes, none of us spoke. At last, Elias could endure the silence no longer. "Mr. Holmes," he burst out, "you must tell me the truth. What am I to expect? Am I doomed as my father was?" Holmes rose suddenly, his eyes flashing with decision. "You are not doomed, Mr. Thorne, not if we act swiftly and wisely. There is method in these threats, and method may be met with counter-method. These men, whoever they are, operate under ritual. Ritual is predictable. That is their weakness. I shall discover their next step before they take it." He paced the room, his long fingers steepled before him. "This much is plain. They sent their warning from London. Therefore their agents are here, not in some distant land. We must return at once to the city. Watson, we have seen enough for today. Mr. Thorne, you will accompany us back to Baker Street. Your life will be safer under my immediate watch." Lady Thorne clung to her son, reluctant to let him go, but Holmes's firmness prevailed. As our carriage rolled away from the estate, I glanced back at the house, standing solitary amid the gathering dusk. A sense of foreboding clung to it, as though the very walls remembered the vengeance sworn against its master. During the journey, Holmes spoke little. He sat motionless, his gaze fixed upon some point beyond the window, his mind, I knew, working furiously upon the tangled skein. At length he roused himself and spoke in a tone that brooked no dissent. "Watson, tonight we must keep watch. If these men seek to strike, it will be soon. Let them come, perhaps we may catch them at their work. One thread already begins to tighten, and I mean to follow it to the—" Noose Elias Thorne said nothing, but I saw him grip the seat until his knuckles whitened. For myself, I could not shake the image of those 5 withered pips lying like a silent curse upon our table, nor the sense that in taking this young man under our roof, we too had been drawn into the shadow of that deadly warning. We arrived back in London beneath a sky thick with fog, the lamps glowing faintly through the gloom, like watchful eyes. Holmes hurried Elias Thorne into the warmth of our Baker Street chambers, where the fire burned bright upon the hearth. He wasted no time in setting his plans. "You will sleep here, Mr. Thorne," he declared, indicating the sofa that he had already arranged with blankets. "Watson and I shall keep vigil. It is possible your enemies may attempt to strike at you openly, though more likely they will try some subtler means. Either way, they shall not find us unprepared." Thorn assented with a weary nod, sinking heavily into the armchair by the fire. The strain of fear and sleepless nights was plain upon his face, and I confess that my heart went out to the young man. Holmes, meanwhile, busied himself with small but telling preparations. He drew the curtains close, checked the fastenings of the windows, and even arranged a mirror at such an angle that he might observe the street without being seen. Then, lighting his pipe, he sat cross-legged upon the rug, eyes half closed, as though in contemplation of some intricate chessboard upon which the next move would soon be played. The hours passed slowly. Midnight came, then 1 o'clock. Outside, the city's roar had dwindled to the occasional rattle of a carriage or the distant call of a watchman. Elias Thorne dozed fitfully, starting awake at every sound, while Holmes remained perfectly motionless, save for the faint glow of his pipe. For my part, I struggled against drowsiness, determined not to let my guard falter. It was shortly after 2 when Holmes stirred at last. He raised a finger in warning, his keen ears having caught something I had not. I listened intently. At first there was only silence. Then, faintly, from the street below, the measured tread of footsteps. They paused, resumed, then halted directly beneath our window. Holmes rose noiselessly, peered into the mirror, and returned with a smile that was more grim than glad. "A watcher," he whispered, tall, heavy-shouldered, standing in the shadow of the lamp-post. "He has been there these 10 minutes. We are not alone in this game, Watson." I felt a chill despite the fire. Thorne, roused by our whispering, looked to Holmes with wide, frightened eyes. "They have found me, then?" "On the contrary," Holmes said softly, "they have betrayed themselves. An enemy who shows his face has already lost the advantage of secrecy. Remain calm, Mr. Thorne, for tonight they will do nothing rash. They wish you to stew in fear, but tomorrow we may strike first." With that assurance, we maintained our watch until dawn. The man below departed before the first light crept into the sky, and Holmes, who had observed his retreat, declared himself satisfied. He turned eastward, Watson, toward the river. "We shall follow that scent soon enough." Our breakfast was a quiet affair, for Elias scarcely touched his food, and Holmes ate only mechanically, his thoughts plainly elsewhere. After the meal, Holmes took his violin, drew a few sharp notes from it, then set it down again with an impatient gesture. "Come, Watson. The day will not wait upon us. Mr. Thorne, you are safest here. I advise you to stir little from these rooms. If you must go out, it shall be under our escort. For now, remain." Leaving our client thus, we set out into the city once more. Holmes led the way with swift strides, and I knew better than to ask our destination until he chose to reveal it. At last, as we turned into the Strand, he spoke. "Or the watcher of last night, Watson, his build, his stance, the manner in which he held himself, it smacks of the seafaring man. I have observed enough dockside figures to be sure of it. He made east, and where does east lead us but to the wharves of the Thames? There I believe we shall find our adversary's lair. We descended into the district by the river, where the air was thick with the smell of tar and salt, and where rough men in sailors' garb crowded the taverns and alleys. Holmes passed among them with his usual unobtrusive grace, listening, observing, noting each scrap of dialect, each glance exchanged. At one grimy public house he paused, stooped to examine the ground, and then straightened with satisfaction. "See here, Watson, the orange peel trodden into the mud, and not of the fresh fruit one buys at market, but the withered skin of a dried pip. Our men have been near. We entered the tavern, a low-ceilinged den filled with smoke and the reek of cheap gin. Holmes ordered a drink with the air of a man at leisure, but his eyes missed nothing. At a corner table sat two fellows of villainous aspect, one broad-shouldered with a scar across his cheek, the other lean and swarthy, his dark eyes darting restlessly about the room. Holmes inclined his head ever so slightly in their direction. "Mark them, Watson." "Do you note the foreign cast of the smaller man?" "Indian, I should judge by his complexion and manner." His companion, English, but of the rough sailor breed. A curious pair to be in such close company. We sat quietly, feigning indifference, while Holmes listened intently to their low conversation. I could catch little beyond the occasional word, "Pips," "7 days," and once the unmistakable name, Thorn. Holmes's lips tightened, and I knew he had heard enough. We left the tavern soon after, Holmes guiding me swiftly into the fog-shrouded street. "There is no longer doubt, Watson. These men are the messengers of that ancient brotherhood. The Indian is their envoy, the sailor their blade. They spoke of Thorn and of the very tokens that haunt him. We have placed our feet firmly upon their trail. I asked what our next move must be, but Holmes raised his hand for silence. "Not yet, Watson. We cannot seize them without proof, nor can we shadow them without risk of discovery. Patience. They will make their play soon enough, and when they do, we shall be ready." For now, we returned to Baker Street. Elias Thorn met us anxiously upon our arrival. He had spent the day pacing like a man condemned, and the relief upon his face when Holmes entered was pitiful to behold. Holmes reassured him with calm words, though his eyes betrayed the gravity of his thoughts. "This night again we shall keep vigil," he told us both. "But I sense the storm is near at hand. Prepare yourself, Mr. Thorn. Your enemies will not waste many more hours before attempting their stroke. Yet take heart, they reckon without Sherlock Holmes." And with that he resumed his watchful post by the window, while outside the fog thickened once more, cloaking the city in shadows that seemed alive with unseen menace. That evening the air hung heavy with a clammy fog that pressed close against the windows of Baker Street. Holmes had dined sparingly, his mind evidently elsewhere, while Thorn scarcely touched his plate. I endeavoured to engage him in conversation, but his thoughts returned always to the dreadful warning and to the sense that time was slipping fast through his fingers. Holmes, by contrast, seemed possessed of a strange, almost languid calm, as though he were a chess player awaiting a move that he had already foreseen. When the clock struck 11, Holmes rose and extinguished all but a single lamp, leaving the room in half-shadow. He stationed Thorn upon the sofa once more, bade me take the chair by the hearth, and himself resumed his silent post at the window. The hours crept by with intolerable slowness. Outside the street was deserted, the lamps casting feeble circles of light upon the mist. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional restless stir of our anxious guest. At last, as the hour approached 2, Holmes's hand shot up suddenly in warning. He bent over the mirror set upon the sill, his eyes glinting in the dim glow of the lamp. "They are here," he whispered. I rose at once, every nerve taut. Through the mirror I glimpsed a shadow moving cautiously along the opposite pavement, then another and a third, their outlines vague in the fog. They halted beneath our window. One lifted his head, as if listening. Holmes's lips moved soundlessly. 3 of them, the sailor, the Indian, and another, short, stocky. Watch closely. The next moment came a faint scrape at the door below. Thorn started violently, but Holmes motioned him to silence. We listened, scarcely daring to breathe, as the stealthy sound of a key being tried in the lock reached our ears. Holmes had already drawn a revolver from his pocket. He pressed another into my hand. "Steady, Watson. We shall let them commit themselves. Once they cross the threshold, the law will be on our side." The lock clicked faintly. A cautious footstep sounded upon the stair. Then, as the door of our sitting room trembled under a tentative pressure, Holmes uttered a sharp cry. "Now!" He flung the door wide, and we burst into the passage. A startled figure sprang back, a thick-set man in rough seaman's dress. Behind him loomed the broad-shouldered sailor we had seen at the tavern, and peering over his shoulder was the dark, swarthy face of the Indian. For an instant they stood frozen, then the seaman drew a knife with a snarl. "Drop it!" Holmes commanded, his revolver levelled. My own covered the second man. There was a tense silence. Then, with a curse, the sailor let the blade clatter to the floor. The others followed his lead, raising their hands. In another moment Holmes had flung open the street door, his whistle piercing the night. A constable on his beat came running, and between us we secured the prisoners with little struggle. They were conveyed at once to the nearest station, Holmes himself accompanying them, while I remained behind to calm Elias Thorne, who was nearly overcome with the shock. When Holmes returned an hour later, his expression was one of mingled satisfaction and concern. He flung himself into a chair, lit his pipe, and regarded Thorne keenly. "You are safe for the present, Mr. Thorne. The police have them in custody, but I warn you, the true danger is not ended. These are but the agents, not the masters. For every sailor we catch, there are a dozen more ready to step into his place. The mind that sends these pips remains at large." Thorne buried his face in his hands. "Then what hope is there for me?" he groaned. "Every hope," Holmes said firmly. "For now we hold 3 threads in our hand. Their silence will not last. A man who fears the rope may be made to speak, and already I have gleaned more than they suppose." He leaned toward us, his voice low. In the tavern they spoke of the Brotherhood of the Seed. "The Indian carries upon his person a token carved in the same shape as the one we found in Sir Reginald's box. This is no scattered band of villains, but an organized society bound by oath, relentless in vengeance. Its roots lie in India, but its branches spread even here in London. That is why the pips come from the post. Ritual is their weapon as much as blade or poison." I confess I felt a chill at his words. Holmes alone seemed unshaken, though his face was grave. He drew from his pocket a small scrap of paper. Before they were separated, the sailor dropped this. It is a fragment of a shipping schedule marked with the name Calcutta Queen, moored at present near Wapping. That, Watson, is our next step. If the true architect of this terror lurks anywhere, it will be among the holds and cabins of that vessel. Thorne grasped Holmes's arm imploringly. "You will not leave me? You will not abandon me to their vengeance?" Holmes's eyes softened for an instant. "You have my word, Mr. Thorne. But I must follow the trail where it leads. Watson will remain with you until I return. If aught should happen to me, he will see you safe." The young man clutched at this assurance like a drowning sailor at a rope. As for myself, I could not hide my unease at Holmes's intention of venturing alone into what seemed a nest of vipers. Yet I knew remonstrance would be useless. He was already shrugging on his cloak, his face alight with the grim energy that always possessed him when he scented the heart of a mystery. "Rest, Watson," he said briskly. "We shall need all our strength before this is ended. If fortune favours me, I shall return before dawn." With that, he was gone into the fog. The hours that followed were among the longest of my life. I sat by the fire, revolver at hand, while Elias Thorne paced ceaselessly. Each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind against the window, set him trembling. I did my best to reassure him, though my own mind was torn with fear for Holmes. At last, just as the first grey light of morning stole into the room, the door opened and Holmes entered. His coat was damp, his hair disordered, but his eyes shone with the fierce brilliance of triumph. "We have them, Watson," he cried. "The web is tightening." A name has been spoken, a master revealed. The game grows darker, but the end is in sight. He sank into his chair, exhausted yet exultant, while Thorne and I waited breathlessly for the tale of what he had uncovered in the night. Holmes flung off his sodden cloak and shook the rain from his hat, then lowered himself into his chair with the air of a man whose body was weary, but whose mind burned with fierce vitality. Elias Thorne leapt to his feet, unable to contain himself. "For heaven's sake, Mr. Holmes, tell us, what have you discovered?" Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe before answering, as though arranging his thoughts in the precise order that alone satisfied his rigorous mind. "I went down to Wapping, Watson, to the berth of the Calcutta Queen. She is a merchant steamer recently arrived from Bombay, and outwardly as commonplace a vessel as any that rides the Thames. Yet, as I suspected, her crew harbours more than mere sailors. It took some ingenuity and a judicious disguise to pass among them unremarked. For a time I was but another tar, sharing their grog and listening to their talk. And talk they did, though guardedly, for liquor loosens even the most secretive tongue." He leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "They spoke of one they called the Master of Seeds. He is their leader here in London, a man who enforces oaths sworn in India long ago. His name, however, is not Indian, but English, Jonathan Arkwright, a merchant of some repute, trading in silks and spices, yet in truth the very hand behind these tokens of death. It was he who directed the threats against Sir Reginald, and it is he who now seeks to finish what was begun." Elias Thorne's face blanched. "Arkwright? I know the name. My father spoke of him once bitterly. He called him unscrupulous, said he would stop at nothing for gain. I thought it a passing quarrel of commerce. I never dreamed—" Holmes interrupted gently. "Your father was not deceived, Mr. Thorne. The quarrel was no trifle. Arkwright was among those who formed this brotherhood, and he has never forgiven Sir Reginald for betraying their bond. Whether it was money or a matter more sinister, we shall soon learn, but of this I am certain, he will not rest until his vengeance is complete." I could not restrain my astonishment, but Holmes, to expose such a man, to accuse him of murder and conspiracy, will require proof beyond mere whispers in a tavern. "Just so, Watson, and proof we shall have. Even now the police hold the 3 ruffians we took last night. Arkwright cannot know how much they may betray under questioning. He will move quickly to strike, lest his schemes unravel. That haste, Watson, is our opportunity." Elias gripped the back of a chair as though for support. "Then I am still marked for death." Holmes regarded him keenly. "You are. But this time we hold the advantage. Arkwright expects you to cower, to flee, or to hide. Instead, you shall do none of these things. You shall walk openly where I direct you, and by so doing you shall draw him from his hole." Thorne stared at him in horror. "You would use me as bait?" Holmes's expression softened. "I would use you as shield, Mr. Thorne, if only I could. But we must confront the danger head-on. Fear not. You will not be alone. Watson and I shall be at your side, though unseen. Together we shall spring the trap." The young man wavered, torn between terror and trust. At last he nodded, pale but resolute. "Very well. I place myself entirely in your hands." Holmes inclined his head gravely, then turned to me. "Watson, there is much to arrange. This morning we shall pay a call upon Lestrade at Scotland Yard. I have need of his assistance, though he will grumble at the method. Come, we must not waste a moment." Within the hour we were rattling through the streets in a cab, the fog lifting under a watery sun. Lestrade received us with his usual mixture of scepticism and deference. Holmes laid before him the evidence we had gathered, the letters of Sir Reginald, the token of the seed, the fragment of the shipping schedule, and, above all, the testimony of the 3 prisoners. Lestrade frowned. "It's thin, Mr. Holmes, very thin. To move against a respectable merchant like Arkwright on such grounds, why, the Commissioner himself would laugh me out of the yard." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then do nothing, Lestrade. Merely provide me with a pair of your plainclothes men and place them where I direct. If I fail, you may wash your hands of me. But if I succeed, the credit shall be yours." Lestrade, half grudging, half intrigued, agreed. And so the plan was laid. That evening Elias Thorne would attend upon an acquaintance at his club, walking openly through the Strand. Holmes predicted that Arkwright's agents, desperate to silence him, would attempt some stroke. Hidden in the crowd, we should be ready. All day Holmes moved with restless energy, preparing every detail, instructing Thorne with quiet firmness, and arranging signals with Lestrade's men. By the time dusk fell, our course was set as firmly as any military campaign. At 7:30 we set out. Thorne, dressed in his best, walked with outward composure, though I could feel the tremor in his step. Holmes and I followed at a discreet distance, blending with the throng of evening strollers. The Strand was alive with carriages and gaslight, the theatres spilling their patrons into the night air. We had not gone far when Holmes gave a slight start and touched my arm. "There, by the lamp-post. Do you see him, Watson? The sailor, released already by some hand or else another of the Brotherhood, near enough his twin. And behind him, yes, the Indian. They follow, close." My heart quickened. The 2 men shadowed Thorne, closing the distance as he passed beneath the portico of the club. Suddenly the sailor quickened his pace, his hand darting to his coat as though for a weapon. At that instant Holmes sprang forward with the swiftness of a striking hawk. "Now, Watson," he cried. I rushed to Thorne's side as Holmes seized the sailor's wrist. The man snarled and struck, but Holmes twisted his arm with a dexterity that forced the knife clattering to the pavement. The Indian darted forward, but Lestrade's plainclothes men, emerging from the crowd at the appointed signal, seized him by the shoulders. In a moment the street was in uproar, cries rising, carriages halting, onlookers pressing close. Holmes stood calm amid the tumult, his grip still iron upon the sailor's wrist. "You will convey these men at once to the yard," he commanded. "Search them thoroughly." "Their tongues will loosen soon enough." Lestrade hurried to obey, while Thorne, shaken but unharmed, clung to me in relief. Holmes watched the prisoners carried off, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "We have clipped the claws of the Brotherhood," he murmured. "Now, Watson, only one remains, the master himself. Before this week is ended, Jonathan Arkwright shall answer for his seeds of death." The tumult in the Strand that night had scarcely subsided before Holmes hurried us away from the gathering crowd. He was never one to linger once a stroke had been played, for he valued the quiet unfolding of his deductions above any public acclaim. Elias Thorne, pale and trembling, leaned heavily upon my arm as we made our way back toward Baker Street. Holmes walked a pace ahead, silent, his brows drawn together in that peculiar inward frown which always heralded some fresh chain of reasoning. Once within our sitting-room, Holmes threw himself into his chair, clasped his hands beneath his chin, and stared into the fire. For some minutes he did not speak. Thorne, unable to contain himself, broke the silence. "You saved my life, Mr. Holmes. But will they never cease? If one be arrested, another rises in his place. How can I stand against an enemy that multiplies like Hydra's heads?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "That is the very point, Mr. Thorne. Cut off the limbs and they will grow again. But strike at the heart and the monster dies." "We must strike at Jonathan Arkwright himself," I could not help interjecting. "But how, Holmes? The man is a merchant of standing. We have no direct evidence linking him to these crimes." Holmes smiled faintly, though there was little mirth in it. "No evidence yet, Watson? But recall, those who act in ritual cannot resist leaving their mark. These pips, this carved token, the very words repeated in their threats. These are not accidents but signs. I warrant that Arkwright surrounds himself with such symbols even now. Our task is to place him in possession of one." Beyond denial, Thorne looked doubtful. "Would he be so careless?" "He cannot help it," Holmes replied. "The fanatic betrays himself by devotion to form. Arkwright will think himself invulnerable, and therein lies our opportunity. He has already overreached in unleashing his agents upon the Strand. Such recklessness speaks of a man under pressure. He fears discovery, and that fear will compel him to act again. We must anticipate the form of his next move." Holmes rose abruptly, fetched the iron box of Sir Reginald's papers, and spread them once more upon the table. "See here, Watson," he said, pointing to a letter. "This one, dated 72, speaks of an oath taken in Calcutta. Each man was to hold in trust a portion of the profits from certain ventures, profits ill-gotten, I suspect. Should any man betray the trust, the others swore he should eat the seed of judgment. Note the phrase. It matches the warnings precisely. I bent over the letter, tracing the faded words. Then Sir Reginald betrayed them, refused to honour their compact? Exactly so. And Arkwright, as one of the oath-bound, assumed the mantle of executioner. He has pursued the vendetta across the years, keeping alive a fire most men would have let burn out. Holmes's eyes gleamed with cold light. Such obsession is his weakness. He must proclaim his vengeance, or it is nothing. At that moment a knock sounded at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a note just delivered by hand. Holmes tore it open. Inside lay a single, withered orange pip, wrapped in paper upon which were scrawled the words, "The last seed falls tonight." Elias Thorne gave a strangled cry. Holmes's face hardened, as I expected. He means to finish the work before his agents can betray him. Take heart, Mr. Thorne. He has overplayed his hand. He sprang into action, issuing instructions with the rapidity of a general on campaign. "Watson, fetch your revolver and cloak. Thorne, you must do exactly as I say without hesitation. We go at once to Arkwright's warehouse by the river. That is where he will strike, his lair, his altar. He will not resist the chance to enact his ritual upon his chosen ground." Within the half-hour we were rattling eastward in a cab, the fog curling like ghostly fingers about the gas lamps. Holmes sat rigid, his eyes gleaming with fierce anticipation. Thorne shivered beside me while I fingered the revolver in my pocket and prayed we were not being lured into some fatal snare. The warehouse loomed before us, a hulking shadow on the wharf, its windows dark save for a faint glimmer within. Holmes led the way, silent as a cat, until we stood pressed against the damp brick wall. From within came the sound of voices, low, urgent, and unmistakably tense. Holmes motioned us to silence, then crept to a window and peered through a crack in the shutter. After a moment he returned, his face grim. "Arkwright is within, alone, but armed. He paces like a man possessed, and upon the table lies a small heap of orange pips. The stage is set. Thorne's knees nearly gave way beneath him. "I cannot face him," he whispered hoarsely. "You must," Holmes said firmly, "but you shall not be alone. Watson and I will be at your back. All you need do is confront him, and the rest I shall manage." We entered by a side door that yielded to Holmes's deft hand. The interior was vast and shadowy, filled with the smell of spices and hemp. At the centre, a single lamp burned upon a table, casting its glow upon a tall man in a merchant's coat. His hair was iron grey, his face sharp and cruel, his eyes gleaming with fanatic fire. Jonathan Arkwright. At the sight of Elias he straightened, his hand closing upon a revolver that lay upon the table. "So," he said, his voice low and venomous, "the seed has brought you at last, as it brought your father before you. The oath must be fulfilled." Thorne faltered, but Holmes stepped forward into the light, his own revolver levelled. "The oath is ended, Arkwright. You are undone. Your agents lie in custody, your symbols betray you, and your every step has been traced. The game is finished." Arkwright's eyes flickered, but his hand did not waver. "Finished? Never. I carry this seed until death, and if death it must be, then let it fall." He snatched at the revolver, but Holmes was quicker. With a cry, I sprang forward as Holmes struck the weapon from his grasp. It clattered across the table. Arkwright lunged desperately, but between us we bore him down, pinning his arms while he cursed and struggled like a madman. Holmes's voice cut through the tumult, calm and implacable. "Enough! The brotherhood of the seed ends here." In another moment Lestrade and his men, summoned by Holmes's foresight, burst through the door, and Jonathan Arkwright, the master of seeds, was secured at last. Elias Thorne sagged against me, half in relief, half in exhaustion, while Holmes stood tall, his eyes alight with the grim satisfaction of victory. Yet as the man was dragged away, still raving of oaths and vengeance, I could not help but feel that some dark current, born in the heat of India's sun, had flowed across the years to break finally upon the stones of London's docks, and that we had but narrowly escaped being swept away in its torrent. The echo of Arkwright's furious cries still rang in my ears as the policeman dragged him from the warehouse. His face, twisted with venom, lingered in the lamplight for an instant before vanishing into the fog, leaving behind only the overturned table and the scattered pips that gleamed like pale embers upon the boards. Elias Thorne, trembling violently, clutched at my arm for support. Holmes, however, stood immovable, his eyes fixed upon the door through which the man had passed, as though his mind were following a thread still unspooled. At length he turned, stooped, and with gloved fingers gathered the dried pips from the floor, placing them carefully into an envelope. "These tokens have served their purpose," he said gravely. "Let them now be turned against their master." Lestrade, bustling with importance, came striding back. "We got him secure, Mr. Holmes. A nasty piece of business, but he'll not trouble your client again. I'll see him before the magistrate within the day." Holmes inclined his head, but did not smile. "Do so, Lestrade. Yet take heed, this is no common criminal. Arkwright is but the remnant of a society whose tendrils run wide. He will not confess easily, nor will his brethren abandon him. Guard him well, or you may find your cell empty before morning." The inspector gave a snort of disbelief, though he promised doubled watch. With that the police withdrew, leaving us to return to Baker Street in a cab that rattled across the slick stones. Elias sat in silence, his features drawn and pale, while Holmes leaned back with closed eyes, lost in some deep inner calculation. When at last we reached our rooms, Holmes threw himself into his chair and motioned for brandy to be poured. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "we have seized the helm of the storm. Yet whether we have steered into calm waters or upon the rocks remains to be seen." I could not hide my astonishment. "Surely, Holmes, with Arkwright taken and his agents in custody, the affair is at an end?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "If only it were so simple. Think, Watson. Men do not preserve an oath across decades through exile and peril merely to let it perish with one leader. Arkwright is the master in London, but who is the master abroad? And do you suppose they will sit idle while one of their number is brought to trial? Elias, who had sunk into a chair by the fire, looked up with a start. Then I'm not safe after all? You are safer than you were, Holmes answered, but not yet free. Arkwright has been checked, not defeated. We must strike deeper until the Brotherhood itself is broken. The young man's face paled further, but Holmes pressed on with relentless logic. There remains the question of proof. Without it, Arkwright will protest innocence, claiming no more than a merchant's rivalry. The pips and tokens may seem to us damning, but a clever counsel will dismiss them as coincidence. No, what we need, Watson, is the document, the charter that binds them. It exists. Sir Reginald's letters prove as much, and Arkwright will have guarded it jealously. He rose suddenly, pacing the room. It is not in his warehouse. That would be too obvious. Where then? His residence, perhaps, or hidden among his shipping ledgers. If we can seize it, the Brotherhood is undone. Without their oath, they are but common rogues. The next day was consumed in preparations. Holmes dispatched notes to several agents in the riverside districts, men who owed him favours for past services. He himself disappeared for hours, returning with information so precise that I knew he had once again donned one of his innumerable disguises. Elias, restless and fearful, scarcely left the fireside while I did my best to reassure him, though my own confidence was shaken by Holmes's warning. By evening, Holmes had gathered his facts. Arkwright maintains offices near the docks, he informed us, ostensibly for the management of his trade. Within those offices is a safe, heavy and cunningly built. It is there the document will be. Tonight, while he lies in the yard, we shall obtain it. I confess I was startled by his bluntness. Surely, Holmes, you do not mean to break into the man's office? Precisely, Watson. For once the law follows in our wake, not before. Lestrade would never dare sanction such a step, yet without it, Arkwright may walk free. We cannot afford scruples when the Brotherhood's knife hovers still above our client's heart. Elias clasped his hands together, torn between dread and gratitude. I trust you, Mr. Holmes. Do whatever you must. Only, let this be ended. The fog was thick once more when, near midnight, we stole into the narrow lane that led to Arkwright's offices. Holmes had provided himself with tools, and within moments the lock yielded to his touch. We entered a dim chamber lined with shelves of ledgers and bales of goods. At the far wall stood a massive safe of black iron, its polished surface gleaming in the lamplight. Holmes approached it with the air of a surgeon confronting a delicate operation. He knelt, pressed his ear to the metal, and began to turn the dial with infinite patience. I kept watch at the window, my revolver ready, while Elias stood rigid, scarcely daring to breathe. The silence was broken only by the faint clicks of the tumblers within. At last, with a soft metallic sigh, the door swung open. Holmes drew out a bundle of papers bound with red cord. His eyes flashed triumph. Here, Watson, see the seal? A circle enclosing 5 seeds, the Charter of the Brotherhood. He rifled through the pages swiftly, his lips tightening as he read. Names, oaths, punishments, all here, and Arkwright's own signature upon the original parchment. With this, Lestrade can crush him utterly. But even as he spoke, a sound reached my ear, the creak of a board outside. I hissed a warning. Holmes extinguished the lamp at once, plunging us into darkness. We waited, tense, as footsteps approached the door. Then came the faint rasp of a key in the lock. Holmes's voice whispered in my ear. We have company. Watson, stand ready. The Brotherhood has not abandoned its master, after all. The door began to open, slowly, cautiously, and against the pale fog outside I saw the outline of a figure, then another. The trap we had laid was about to close, but whether upon our quarry or upon ourselves, I could not yet tell. The door swung wider, inch by inch, and the pale fog curled into the room like a living thing. Holmes moved not a muscle, but I felt his hand tighten upon my sleeve, a silent command to hold my fire until the moment was ripe. The first figure slipped inside, stooping low, then another followed, heavier in build, and I caught the faint glint of a blade in his hand. A third shadow lingered in the doorway, keeping watch. Holmes struck without warning. With the suddenness of a coiled spring, he seized the foremost intruder by the wrist, wrenching the knife free and hurling the man to the ground. I leapt forward to cover the second, my revolver pressed hard against his chest. He froze, snarling, his hand half drawn from his coat. The third made to flee, but Elias, who until that moment had stood paralyzed, sprang forward with desperate courage and slammed the door shut upon him. Between us, the three were quickly subdued. Holmes lit the lamp once more, and its glow revealed three grim faces, two rough sailors and the same swarthy Indian we had glimpsed before. Their eyes blazed with fanatical hatred, and they spat curses in a tongue I did not know. Holmes regarded them coolly, his revolver steady. "So," he said, "the Brotherhood sends its children to reclaim the charter. You come too late, my friends. It is already in hands stronger than yours." The Indian strained against our grip, his voice harsh. "You do not know what you meddle with. The seed cannot die. Others will come, always others." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "It dies when its roots are torn out, and tonight I hold the root in my hand." He gestured toward the bundle of papers upon the table. "This is your doom." The prisoners were soon conveyed, under Holmes's direction, to a waiting cab, and thence to Scotland Yard, where Lestrade received them with astonishment and no small pride in his own foresight. Holmes, however, wasted no time on ceremony. He placed the charter directly into Lestrade's hands. "Guard this as you would your own life," he instructed. "With it, you have the Brotherhood by the throat. Arkwright's conviction is certain. And more than that, the names upon these pages will lead you to their brethren abroad. Strike swiftly, and you may scatter them to the winds." Lestrade, to his credit, grasped the gravity of the moment. He promised immediate action, and Holmes, satisfied, returned with me and Thorne to Baker Street. It was near dawn when at last we sat once more before our own fire, the glow of triumph upon Holmes's austere features. Elias Thorne, overcome by relief, could scarcely speak. He clasped Holmes's hands with tears in his eyes. "You have saved me, Mr. Holmes. You have broken the curse that slew my father. How can I ever repay such a debt?" Holmes withdrew his hands gently, his smile faint. "By living, Mr. Thorne. Live wisely, live honourably. That is the only repayment I ask." The young man bowed his head, and after a time retired to rest, leaving Holmes and me alone. I studied my friend in the quiet light, marvelling as always at the strange mixture of iron and fire that made up his nature. He sat back in his chair, his eyes half closed, a faint smile playing upon his lips. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "the smallest token may conceal the gravest menace. 5 dried pips, yet behind them stretched a brotherhood of vengeance, a conspiracy spanning continents. Such is the fascination of our work. From the merest trifle we trace the thread that binds the world." I could not help but shake my head in admiration. And yet, Holmes, there were moments when I feared we had overstepped the law. Holmes's smile deepened, but his eyes opened, keen and searching. The law, Watson, is a blunt instrument. Justice requires finer tools. Tonight we used them. Let us trust the Yard to wield the heavier hammer now that we have struck the true blow. The case did not end there, though in its essentials it was concluded. In the days that followed, the newspapers carried the sensational account of Jonathan Arkwright's downfall. The Charter of the Brotherhood, published in part at the trial, revealed a society bound by blood oath in the heat of India, surviving through decades by fear and secrecy. Arkwright's conviction was swift. His agents, faced with irrefutable evidence, turned upon one another, and the Brotherhood's London branch collapsed in disgrace. Elias Thorne remained with us until the verdict was passed, his gratitude to Holmes growing each day. When at last he returned to Sussex, he did so with a lighter step, freed from the terror that had haunted him. He promised to honour his father's name, not by vengeance, but by upright living. And Holmes, who rarely betrayed sentiment, seemed quietly pleased. On a quiet evening not long after, as we sat together in Baker Street, I ventured to remark upon the case. "It was among your most chilling adventures, Holmes. To think that a man's fate might be sealed by so simple a thing as 5 orange pips." Holmes's gaze turned thoughtful, almost philosophical. "Life, Watson, is written in trifles. The great crimes of history have often been heralded by the smallest tokens: a footprint in dust, a scrap of paper, a withered seed. It is not the size of the clue, but the mind that perceives its weight. Remember that, and you will understand my trade." He rose then, crossing to the window. The fog had lifted, and the lamps of Baker Street glowed clear in the night air. Holmes drew upon his pipe and let the smoke drift upward, his profile cut sharp against the glass. "There will be other cases, Watson," he said quietly. "Other seeds sown in darkness. It is our task to see that they do not bear fruit," and with that he fell silent, lost once more in the mysteries of the night, while I, ever his companion and chronicler, marvelled anew at the strange genius of Sherlock Holmes. Several weeks passed before the last threads of the case were neatly tied. Jonathan Arkwright, unmasked and confronted with the damning charter of the Brotherhood, had at first maintained a mask of injured innocence. Yet the mounting weight of evidence, his agent's confessions, the recovered tokens, the papers bearing his own signature, crushed even his arrogance. He was condemned to lifelong penal servitude, a fate far gentler than that which he had meted out to others, but one which ensured his malign hand would trouble no man again. The newspapers feasted upon the trial. The seeds of vengeance blazed across the headlines, and the public thrilled at tales of the Brotherhood's oaths, its rituals, and its chilling symbol of the orange pips. Many speculated on how far the conspiracy had spread, but Holmes, with characteristic restraint, spoke little to reporters. He allowed Lestrade to bask in the triumph, though I knew full well how much of the case had turned upon Holmes's relentless pursuit of truth. Elias Thorne returned at last to his estate in Sussex. The terror that had clung to him seemed to fall away with the winter fog, and when he visited us before his departure, his eyes were brighter and his step firmer. "I owe you more than life, Mr. Holmes," he said, simply. "I owe you freedom from a shadow I thought eternal." Holmes accepted the words with a quiet inclination of the head, nothing more. Yet I could see that the gratitude touched even his iron heart. One evening, when the case was already fading from the public mind, I found Holmes seated by the fire, his violin lying idle across his knees. The room was thick with pipe smoke, and he was gazing into the embers with that distant look I had come to know so well. I ventured to stir him from his reverie. "Holmes," I said, "there is one point that still puzzles me. You saw the danger from the moment those 5 pips scattered across our table. What was it that told you they were no mere prank?" He smiled faintly, the smoke curling from his lips. "The answer, Watson, lies not in the pips themselves but in the pattern. Your average criminal employs a knife or pistol. Only a mind bound by ritual would choose such a trivial token for so deadly a purpose. And ritual, my dear fellow, is the spoor of a society, an oath, a brotherhood. From that instant, the case was clear. I merely followed the chain where it led, from pip to letter, from letter to oath, from oath to Arkwright." I shook my head in admiration. "Yet the courage with which you faced them, the calmness in the warehouse, the trap in the Strand, that was more than a deduction. That was sheer nerve." Holmes's expression softened, though he waved away the compliment with a flick of his hand. "Nerve, perhaps. But remember, Watson, I never gamble. Each move I made was but the inevitable consequence of the step before. Had I faltered, we might well have been undone. Logic, not bravery, was our shield. We sat in companionable silence for a while until Holmes stirred again. It is curious, is it not, how vengeance outlives reason? A quarrel over gold in the heat of India, and years later it sends death stalking through the fog of London. Men bind themselves to oaths, thinking them unbreakable, yet they forget that time itself unravels every knot. Arkwright clung to a vow until it destroyed him, while his victim's son lives free because he sought counsel instead of surrender. He rose then, placed the violin upon his shoulder, and drew from it a soft, contemplative strain. The notes filled the room, mingling with the crackle of the fire, carrying with them something of the melancholy and grandeur of the case we had so lately lived through. As the music faded, Holmes set down the instrument and smiled across at me. "Come, Watson. Tomorrow there will be another knock at our door, another tale of darkness. The world sows many seeds of mischief, and it is our lot to pluck them before they bear their bitter fruit. Until then, let us enjoy a quiet evening. Even the hunter must rest between pursuits," and so ended the strange affair of the 5 orange pips, a case that began with a handful of shriveled seeds and ended with the destruction of a brotherhood whose shadow had stretched across 2 continents. To me it remains among the most chilling of our adventures, and yet, as always, Holmes treated it as no more than one solved problem in a world brimming with others. He had already turned his gaze forward, listening for the next faint whisper of mystery carried on the London fog.